Greetings again. My name is Tanya Williams, and I'm the Senior Project Coordinator for CP-RND. Welcome to today's open forum. We do have a number of individuals that are still joining today's call, so we will get started shortly. So again, thank you for your patience. Okay. Again, thank you for joining today's CP-RND's Open Public Forum. Again, my name is Tanya Williams, and I'm the Senior Project Coordinator supporting CP-RND. Before we get started with today's discussion, just a few housekeeping tips. One, the chat has been enabled, and so as we are progressing through today's discussion, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to add those to the chat. Please note that at the end of the presentation, there will be an opportunity for Q&A and additional discussion. And so you can, again, drop your questions or comments in the chat, or please feel free to raise your hand and then unmute yourself so that you can ask your question.
Thanks, Tanya. My name is Tom Hart. I'm the Director of Outreach for CP-RND. I see a lot of familiar names and faces, so glad to see everybody joining. Before I hand it over to Colin, I just wanted to let you know I will be working in the chat to gather your questions and help organize them. I know that there's a limited amount of time today, and oftentimes we have more questions than time to discuss. So we gather those and continue to work to answer those questions for everybody. If you have any issues, please reach out to me. My information will be in the chat, and also I'll be available by email if you need it. Thanks. Colin, take it away.
Sure. Today, I'm going to provide an update and overview of some of the progress within CP-RND, but I'm going to do this in a little different context. I'm not going to go heavily into the work products themselves. I'm going to really orient you to what's been done and what the impact is and potential the next steps. I'll refer you in some cases to some webinars that really talk about the details of the science and some of the work products themselves and walk them more closely. I don't want that to be the main focus of the conversation. I want to really talk about, like, you are here, in the journey and what the next steps are. I will touch on some of the topics relevant to the output, but that will not be the focus of the presentation. In part, the last part of this is we wanted to give ample time, and I apologize to the community because I myself have been off some of these meetings, and probably some of it because of oversight. But I really value giving my time to the community, and I want to make sure that you know that you all can reach out and connect, and I'll give you the best answers that I have, because unless we collaborate and communicate effectively, there's no way we're going to be successful in executing and making impact. Okay, next slide. Okay, next slide. The first part of this is going to be talking about some of our COA's work. This is a project that was funded through FDA, largely out of their observation of where we were. There were a lot of concerns that we had communicated, and as well as other members in the community around the ALS FRS. And one of the things that I think people were struggling with as we were defining unmet needs in this space were, how do you actually go to commit to something that would be a for purpose clinical outcome assessment? And so what's fortunate is that, FDA, seeing the confusion and seeing a lot of the needs that were expressed, really said, you all really need to be thorough with this. You all, you really need to dig deep into the COA. And some of that was, I think, if I listen to the community, was a little bit behind the closed doors. And I will say that with the idea is that this was droll stuff related to literature review. We've tried to communicate these in meetings and public forums as we get the results. The next steps, I think, is where we'll see more external facing interactions, because we needed to begin to set the table and begin to collect the information that would help us identify, what had already been done in this space and really do a deeper dive. So really the goals of this first set of projects, and I'm going to, like I said, I'll refer you to the webinars to discuss them thoroughly, and you'll be able to hear our vice president for our COA program, and then Michelle Campbell from FDA really speak to what was done. But I want to just revisit to this and talk about what the goals were and sort of the high level messaging here. They were identify the concepts that are important and meaningful to persons with living experience, to identify the tools that were related to those concepts. And we took a rational approach to that, taking into account things that the reviewers suggested, things that were in clinical trials, things that were being used in natural history studies, and things that were being considered for the ALS study. And so we worked closely with them and how those were selected. We also looked at trying to assess, what areas there were further developmental needs, and then really understanding some of the DHT space, digital health technologies. And for those that may not be as familiar with that term, a DHT or digital health technology might be something like, you've seen those actigraph, motion sensors and things that people do remotely to measure like respiratory function. There's things that people are doing now to record speech and look at, speech function. All of those sort of land under the DHT umbrella. And so everybody hears about them, and so we wanted to keep those into consideration as we were beginning to look at COAs, because a DHT can either be a biomarker or it can be a COA. And so we wanted to understand like where things were, and then, how ready they were for both those. And I can tell you where we're at with that and sort of what our next thoughts are for that and recommendations. So next slide. Now, this is the roadmap. I mean, for those of you who've been in other presentations, I'm going to distill this into some simple stuff. I mean, talk about the goals. They're outlined here. I mean, simply put, the initial phrases of this were really landscape analysis, identify those concepts, looking at to measure those and compare those against instruments that are already done, including, instruments that are, as I mentioned, that are more commonly used, as well as in digital health technologies. And then recommendations to fill those gaps are sort of the subsequent steps. And we'll talk through that very briefly. Next slide. And these are the webinars I refer to. Like I said, if you really want to get through the webinars and be able to like hear the FDA and some of our senior scientists here at CPATH, these presentations do an amazing job of walking you through this. And it's really important to understand how regulators appreciate some of these elements. It's because, I mean, I'm a trialist by nature. Many of you that know me have known I'm a clinician and a trialist by my training. And so, I think of this, in a different context. And so their perspective really gives, how is VID from someone who actually works in this space. The goal of that really, understanding is, remember, we want to get instruments that can translate scientific discovery into actually drugs that are available for patients. And so having, COAs and DHTs that can do that, lead to the interpretation of establishing safety and efficacy. That's what we want to get to. Everybody, people had concerns of what our current, endpoints and COAs were. this is some of the initial steps to do that, and you'll have just a really good presentation from both of them and some of the work there, and a deeper dive than I'll provide you today. Next slide. These were the concepts that were identified. I mean, functionally, what this really looked like was there was a lot of stuff in the literature, and basically this had to be aggregated into domains that people could understand. So it might be like a phrase that was used in qualitative research that had been done in a small population over a specific small element, or it could be things that are just described in just different ways and phenomena. So this was aggregated into these different domains. And so we looked at these and we tried to determine, amongst this other core set, things that might be amendable to actually clinical treatments. So like improvements of quality of life, even though they're important, may not necessarily make this directly because a drug wouldn't fill the definition of an endpoint. If a quality of life measure wouldn't be to meet the Phil's function survive discussions of an endpoint. The other thing that you would find is that there might be things that might not be like improved socialization. That might be something that a company may not be as keen on or sensitive to for a treatment. That might be a byproduct of the treatment, but it may not be something directly amendable to the treatment of itself. And so these were ones that we ended up vetting with the review division at the FDA that sort of met all those things of, okay, this is something that's a common concept that might be amenable to treatment, and that it was consistent within the literature review that was done. Next slide. Now, I'm not going to go into detail for the slides. I mean, because each of these has a very technical element to them and what they're. But I really want to highlight here is that, as you can see, the green is good. The X's are really weak, and the question marks are, we're not sure that there's really good, adequate data to support that. And what you see is a red box there. And that red box is important, particularly because that typically revolves persons with the influence with the medical condition. So as you can see across the board, there's a big gap involving patients in the construct of these instruments. So when we did the review, that was something that was very apparent, that many of them didn't have the community's interaction and development. That may have happened, but it couldn't be found within what we had researched. Okay, so that was a clear issue that was identified, is that amongst many of the instruments that are being used today, they really didn't have persons with living experience involved in their construct. Next slide. Now, talk about the DHT work. I mean, I'm going to simplify this in a very high level, and I think I've talked to many of you about this because it was a bit surprising to me, given a lot of the rumbling that goes on in the community about DHTs. When we looked at the literature, there was a lot of things, that talked maybe about the technical specifics of different, instruments. Some of them are proprietary, some less so. And then what the potential advantages of using DHTs might be, being remote, being accessible, frequency of assessments, those types of things. But really clinical meaningfulness and exactly what concepts are specifically being elucidated weren't always very clear, as well as results being published. And so we found that not only in the case for within the literature, but talking to FDA, what we found is that many cases sponsors aren't submitting those to regulatory review. They're acting as exploratory considerations within clinical trials, and they're actually not being able to be used. And so we've been talking about at CPATH trying to get data that aligns with DHTs, to have webinars that would begin to discuss their use, but also begin to explore data with the data owners that have the research going on, as a way to start understanding of really what's going on, and try to set the stage for regulators to begin to provide some interactive feedback. And so our hope is to begin those discussions, and we're in the process of discussing that with the agency as we speak, and specific individuals that are involved in that research. Next slide. Now, this is a really complicated slide. These are ones we've adapted from our steering committee, so I'm going to boil this down. What we at a high level, what we've been recommending is additional qualitative work be done. And obviously there are many different projects going on right now. There's the ALS that's off the ground now. We have, many other natural history studies that are going on in the U.S. and in other parts of the world. And so, the hope would be to conduct some qualitative hybrid interviews to really look at the importance of the concepts and really to drill down more specifically about, things that relate to bulbar function, which would mean obviously speech and swallowing, motor function, and then respiratory functions and measures. This would also help us inform more about those instruments and the gaps that we had talked about. If you look at that framework that was talked through the roadmap, it would help us really clarify, where the holes might be in those candidate COAs. And then also it would benefit the DHT world. I mean, I can tell you from our review internally and speaking with many investigators, one of the things that that I, and others have noted is that, DHTs at this point, many of them are probably maybe a consideration of a biomarker, but they might not be ready for being considered as a COA because they lack some of the qualitative work that would help them get there. And so, those are what we're recommending as next steps. And so I go to the next slide, please. One of the things that we're working on right now, we make the recommendations. We'll be needing to provide input. The funding is a question mark right now. That's where we're in the gap right now. This initial project was funded by FDA. Our original scope of funding through fundraising with FNH, we have not been able to determine if there's funding there for this project. And so we're at the stage of determining, what funding opportunities might be well. Key strategically about this project is that it's a critical piece in moving, some of the COAs that we have forward, because remember that red box that we looked at, but also the DHT world. The DHT world, would greatly benefit because that would give us the opportunity of considering some of those DHTs beyond that within the biomarker domain, because we would understand more about the clinical meaningfulness and other elements that are important to understanding that concept. So that's where we're at with those. I want to go to the next slide, please. Now, the other pieces of this, and this is where I see more direct involvement with the community. We've been discussing and how to best partner with this effort, because one of the things that we understood very early on was there were lots of different groups trying to look at clinical outcome assessments in different forms and fashions. Some of it related to standardization, some of it related to different ways that the measures were conducted, some of it related to statistical analysis. And so we wanted to be sensitive to that as we interacted with the community. And so one of the things we try to do at CPATH is that, we try to bring folks together in ways to help align efforts and then, produce, output that would be beneficial to all of the stakeholders. And so one of the things initially that came out of the needs assessments that were done was sponsors and researchers in particular expressed that we really need to understand and generate standards for how some of the measurements were conducted and analyzed because of consistency. If you look at like how some of the natural history studies are done and you look at how some of the industry trials are done, I think when I had spoken, you all probably know Angela and Ingie, one of the things that they had started to look at was, using this as an example, was a statistical plan for ALS-FRS in different jurisdictions around the world. And I think, one of the things that they noted was there were like over 20 different methodologies that are being used for how that was analyzed. And that was just one part, things related to different language considerations, different versions, controls. I mean, all the things that you wouldn't think that would be issues or challenges were apparent. And so our first foray into this was to really solicit, some of the areas that were important and then really work for people that haven't been involved with ALS clinical trials to understand, okay, what are some of the areas where you feel that these are issues? Obviously we don't want to boil the ocean if it's not needed, but where are some of the issues that might need to be considered in this approach? And so the first one obviously was ALS-FRS, and we've really held 2 meetings right now that really sort of outlined some things around the statistical analysis plan for that. And we're working on a work package that will come around in a broader way to include more of the community in its discussions. We met at the Montreal meeting just recently to talk more about that. I want to shift some of now that we've got this anchor discussion around the statistical analysis, we need to begin to bring this in more of the domains and concepts around how this needs to be formatted and structured. And that's where I think the community can be more involved now that we sort of have got this nucleus started. We wanted to be really respectful of the efforts of the group that launched and not intrude, but facilitate. And so we hosted the initial meeting and worked in partnership with the second one. What will happen after the first year is we'll have a regular cadence and with specific deliverables. What was nice about this, I can communicate to you all, is that one of the things, I'm ALS adopted, I'll say. I use that term because my background originally was not in ALS. I've been fortunate to be adopted by this warm community, and was that I walked away listening to the conversations and sort of putting my regulatory and my clinical trial hats on. And one of the things that was really, I guess, an unexpected benefit of this was just the conversation around like, hey, these are stuff that we actually need data for to model to address because we don't know. I mean, we need to address these questions because there's some things that were brought up about like enrichment and the weighting of mortality versus the ALS-FRS and how that relates to study design. All of those things started bubbling up, which really were unanticipated, I guess, outcomes of those meetings. And so we're trying to talk about how that might be addressed in another working group that would really focus on addressing those questions. So we have another, obviously measures of strength was another one that came up. Our respiratory measures, we're going to be having a kickoff meeting with, full-fledged start in January. And then, we have one of our measures that we've mentioned. Those are the rough timelines. I'm thinking of the starting of those. These are estimates. If I could start them all by January and get them really kicking, I would be trying to do that. I'm trying to understand what the specific unmet needs of each of the groups so that we can scale it appropriately. Because like I said, going into the ALS-FRS, I thought it was going to be pretty straightforward, and it was not. It was actually, oh, this is a little more complicated. And so, we're fortunate because there's, really good individuals that were involved. What was nice about those discussions were we had people that had actually completed their clinical trials and had a lot of experience in the space. And then we had people that hadn't completed in clinical trials that were very early in these discussions. So, the community really had value of those conversations, because I think just as much as, that learnings for them were really beneficial. And so, all of those will be there. One of the things that we're proud of is partnering with our COA efforts internally at CPATH. We do have some frameworks they have that have developed around creating these. We're trying to create them in the idea that they can be scaled and aligned and look alike, and then they'll be made publicly available to folks. If you look at that list, many of the groups that are out there have some efforts going on in these spaces. And so we're trying to bring those people all together so we can all align on the same page. And so, for example, respiratory measures, some of the NEO researchers have been actively involved in that space. We don't want to divert or to challenge or to undermine what they're doing. We want to bring them into the circle and to be in line to that. We know we're fortunate because there are sponsors now that are in this space and have actually been using them in industry trials. We really want to take the community's experience and come up with the best options and the best strategy to move forward. Next slide.
Hey, Colin.
Yes.
We have a couple of questions. Can I interrupt you
Yeah,
with that?
sure.
Great.
Yep.
So our first question is, did you see Dr. Genge's presentation on the last day in Montreal? She spoke of significant COA work. Is she a part of the PPP?
Yes. In fact, Angela was at our meeting in Montreal and at the first meeting. So yes, she's involved. She was the one that was one of the groups that we aligned in partnership. They asked for help because they needed help with coordination and execution of their work. And so we work with them to try. In fact, we have regular calls with that group to help facilitate things. It wasn't, and the idea, just to reemphasize, we're trying to partner and to add what we have as expertise as an organization and not, duplicate if there's other efforts that are going on. So, and I'm not, because I don't want to create conflicts within this and divergent pathways. It doesn't help our community at all. Who's going to lead the qualitative work? That's a 2D determined, Kathy. We're still in discussion of the funding mechanism. What I can tell you is that our leadership in their CI work, and then Michelle has actually volunteered to help write the protocol if it's funded. So, I think that there's a lot of interest in this space. Most likely it will end up being within people that are formally aligned in like the CR world that's got the interview. What we're trying to, obviously this is a very opportune time in the ALS community to do this because all ALS is starting. We've got a lot of the nonprofit groups that are doing similar things that could help jumpstart these. And so would be a lot of opportunities to bring this as more of a holistic outcome, as a project. And so, we're working through that right now and trying to figure out what the best strategy is. If people want to talk about that offline more, I'm more happy to do that. And where we see our opportunities and challenges, I'd welcome that conversation. I don't want to spend a ton of time, but yes, I see and talk about Andrea. Yeah, we have a list of researchers that are involved in that, and Andreas, who's on this call, really connected us with some of his advisors that they used in the conduct of their study. And so I think we're gonna have a lot of really good support there. What we will be needing to understand, and persons with living experience to really help us guide there, because I think one of my concerns with that in that measure has been in hearing the community say is that adherence is one that's challenging, particularly if we're going to look at this from a DHT's perspective, related to a COA. I really want to understand what are the barriers for that to be done remotely and whatnot. So I mean, being a PD person, trying to do pulmonary function testing and it's not easy sometimes. And so if there are things that we can really learn together and try to do not just the conduct itself, but how does this data get analyzed and reported, and how do you handle missingness and all the other things that would need to be done, and I think it really will be a valuable resource. Any other questions? We'll go to the next one.
Yeah, I think we can go on.
Okay. I'm going to talk about where we're at for agreement. I'll the next slide, agreements. Just to remind you, and right before this, we had a call about the federation parts of this project. And I can tell you we have probably 3 or 4 different meetings a week about this because it's a Herculean task. And I was fortunate to talk to James Berry when I was in Montreal, and we really talked about, some of the challenges, and we talked to some of the researchers that are in this space. But just to give you an overview of what the overall goal is, one of the things that was cited by stakeholders was the need to really take the data that's in the ALS space and put it into a common platform, and put it into a platform that is standardized data elements, that has common data models that are recognized by both researchers as well as regulatory agencies, and link that to the data that's available through a broad variety of research sources. So obviously, from the ALS effort, from industry trials, from the natural history studies, and then the translational research that's being funded in many investigators. And so the idea is to try to create this interconnected web of resources that can be a one-stop shop for access. So like if you were a person that was interested in getting data, you could go to this ALS knowledge platform and request access to the whole cadre of elements of research that would be standardized and connected in an efficient manner. And so those would all be, that's the goal, overall arching goal of this. When you look at the sort of the division of labor for this activity, there was a decision to go with where people's strengths were. And so obviously under the previous AMP programs at FINH and with the support of NIH, clinical and translational research is their thing. They have done an amazing job in other AMP programs about aligning omics research and ingesting omics data and preparing platforms that can host that. That is not what we have. That is not CPA's strength. I will say that. I can just being full transparencies. We can do some levels of this, but we don't have the machinery that exists there yet. It may be in our future, but not right now. So to move this very quickly, we really wanted to capture that expertise and to move it quite along. On our side, CPAT has just a cadre of experience in amassing different data types across different disease states, both in common diseases as well as rare diseases. I think we have over 480 something clinical trials within our data warehouse. We have in our rare disease spaces, we have over 40 different rare diseases for a platform that was launched about under 3 years ago. It's what it allows us to do is become very good about looking at different data types, standardizing in an effective way, working with those communities to help them fill their gaps and whatnot, and creating data that can really, be used in the context of regulatory discussions. And so as a whole, this will all be linked together through an interface that the community will be able to request data from. And so very much a powerful, tool that hopefully adds to the community, but doesn't lose sight of the fact that there's some just amazing researchers out there that have done an amazing job. This will never, ever replace what they're doing because none of these groups will be actively looking at collecting prospective data, but it will taking what they've done, acknowledging it in what we're doing, but also then trying to create connectivity and utility in ways that they may not be able to do immediately in what they're doing for their platform. And so that's the overall goal. Next slide. Now, Tom asked me to put this in there because I want to talk about terminology a little bit and explain things a little bit because I think that this came up on other calls. The community. I just to walk through what this is and what it means, and I'll express some things on there that links this to the first slide we just talked about. A data contribution agreement, simply put, it's a legal document that will document really, from a person who actually owns the data, for them contributing the data. So they basically, it's a contract that somebody, I think the other term people will say is a data sharing agreement. And so basically it's saying, that prior to someone sharing their data, they would execute this, that would be an agreement. This will tell us, if you're talking about risk, that the data was collected ethically, there's, consent that's been done, for sharing of the data, the custodian is able to share it and that they agree to it, that data will be de-identified. And so the other part is that, encourages a process for which a data use committee and what the format is. We usually extend the offer for the data share to be involved in the decision of how the data is shared. And then we additionally ask for, as an appendices to this, like what's in the data, or the data dictionary, and then any things that document supporting of that. So that's part of the agreement. So think about this as it's agreement between who owns the data and like CPATH or the knowledge portal sort of discussion, and whoever has the data. And so these are the context of the data sharing agreement. The next slide. And what data use agreement, if you go to many websites right now that are floating around for existing, is you can request data from. Think of the data use agreement as something that's a legal document between, say, hi, I'm the requester, I want this data set. I'm going to sign off on this making my data request. And so typically that role will require, and I think what's going to happen with the knowledge portal is that there will be, for ALS knowledge portal, is there'll be a scientific plan or use case that needs to be defined as part of that remit. I don't want to get into weeds there, but that's part of the, the plan for that. And then really, assurances that they'll recognize individual databases and whatnot. One of the things that's been very important to the academic community, and we've really been advocating for this in our calls, and planning this out, is that we want to demonstrate separation and acknowledgement of each individual data owner. We want to make sure that they get credit, that their hard work and the individuals who are involved in that individual study, as part of that study are really engaged and acknowledged in that. And so we've been asking individual data owners if there are citation references or things that are there. We can't ensure it, but we believe this is somebody will cite every paper or whatnot. We want to encourage that as something to acknowledge the hard work and the framework that has been done and the preface for creating that initial data. Next slide. Now, one of the things that I want to express that this has not been an easy process. One of the things that originally I think has been really challenging, I think has been, this has been a bit slow. I think the community has I always had questions, and we've had to work through a lot of different things with the sharing process and the structure and address questions, lots and lots and lots of calls. So I think even since July, we've had over 45 contacts now at this point when I've added them up. I think even from the steering committee, I think when we presented these, we're at 30. I think we've escalated, and we've had just many, many more times. And so we have, and I'll frame this a little more. This is a summary slide, but we have about 23 DCAs under active review at this time. So huge amounts. We're trying to exceed expectations with this and doing this. And so, and I'll explain why that is. Next slide. When we originally did our extant data exploration, one of the things that was done is we identified, I think it was about almost 70-ish, different data sets around the world. That could be clinical trials, could be natural history studies, et cetera, et cetera. And we worked with the planning group for this effort to define ones that would be priority. And so these are listed there. Some of it was attainability of access. Some of it was related to what they were, like if they were enriched in biomarkers, for example, or they had a DHT that was really of interest to the community. We tried to, and those are bolded there, some of the ones that were the top 5 that we said we would do within the first year. And so we'll talk about them more lately, but that's the framework. What we decided in the interim is that we realized that the rate limiting step would be the data transfers. And so we said, okay, let's just Herculean throw out this and try to attack this and work through it. Okay. And I want to give you an update to where things are in the next couple slides. Now we have 2 agreements that have been fully executed, and we're in that process of creation for them. The initial MGH data set, was done in part, we have, which is one of the data sets that was originally included in PROACT. We really wanted to work out some of the legal language of MGH because they have a lot of different data sets that exist within their world. And so this was a nice pilot because we really wanted to start considering things like the Healy platform trial, et cetera, because we wanted to get to the controls for that and work through some of the mechanics that would need to create the architecture. The second one was ALS TDI. Remember, the push on the HTs. We really wanted to understand, where we could go with DHTs because that was an area of interest for folks that the DHTs focus. We wanted to be attentive to that, and Fernando has just been so gracious for us to sort of run the gauntlet early. And when we've been heavily in curation process with that, I think I won't go into the nitty-gritty details, but we meet with them about every 2 weeks to talk through the mechanics and whatnot. And so both motor and speech, and we've divided the work. There were multiple efforts going on with curating their large data set. They have 1,000 patients or more, just with DHTs alone. We wanted to get this available ASAP, create it into systems that could be used for regulatory strategies. And so we're working with Answer and some of the Danielle and part of the IBM grant mechanism that they had. And then we have DUAs for others, and we're in the process of discussing, at least for Target, as they're getting the natural history study up online, to be able to get an early transfer to begin to start and look and compare the architecture and think about the common data elements that need to be discussed. Next slide. This is sort of an update where things are. We've had discussions and said that there should be commitments to most of these very early, hopefully in 2025. I think some of them explicitly said January. And these are the ones that have sort of come and bubbled up. We're still trying to work through things with, and I think Target will have changed. We had a really wonderful conversation with Amy yesterday. And I think we're going to start exploring that a little earlier than we were going to. We have looked at some of their speech data through DUA, and with the exploitation of trying to discuss their experience, but also provide some feedback. And then we're working through the Dr. Walk's study, the natural history study. That one's taken a little more time than we would have hoped. And then everything else is sort of the same. And so I want to go through and talk about sort of the other things we found, so that you all in the community understand a little bit more about the challenges, because people have told me they want to understand the challenges. So I want to walk through them. Next slide. One of the things that's happened is that we've tried to stick people to common agreements. Even though the CPATH agreement's flexible, sometimes people want to use their own, right? And so that ends up for a lot of back and forth to try to align on process. We've tried to keep things as close to, so they're comparable, so that their ideal, is maintained, but we make it so that there's similarity in understanding the sharing and et cetera, et cetera. They want to review the data asked request, which is fine. We've been talking about that within the broader governance committee, so that people, might have a representative for their data set, so that they can review the scientific plans that are being discussed. Acknowledgement credits, we've outlined different annotations to try to make sure that, like I said, we don't want to like aggregate all the data and hide the hard work that all these people have done, but we also want to be practical in that, we can enforce that and chase people down to identify that and make sure that people understand the challenges that might, result from that, but we don't want to make that decision for folks. Some of them are just, and I think some of the nonprofits have mentioned this to us, that we have investigators asking them about support for cleaning data and sending it over. We've talked a little about it internally, how that would look like into the steering committee and whatnot. That's still to be determined. But, I know one investigator in particular has expressed that concern. We've heard it. I mean, we're trying to figure out what opportunities there might be to address that. Next slide. I think this was the last one. I think the academic community is one that's probably the more sensitive, and understandably so. They've all really worked amazing to be where they're at. Some of it has been, as this has gone, is really their involvement in the whole process. What we're hoping to do is in beginning to involve them in sort of the COA efforts, as well as the disease modeling and simulation things that we're talking about. We're bringing that group all together and begin to make sure that they understand CPATH or NIH or FNH. No one is charging anybody for their data. I mean, they're not going to be selling their data. They're not going to be creating and trying to do things that are that financially gain from what work has been previously done. Consent, as well as concerns, we've been walking through that. We've been reviewing some of the documents from people to help them understand where they're at for their own frameworks for things, so that they have a clear understanding of what they're capable of doing. That's not unique in ALS. We do this with many other communities, because sometimes there are newer investigators, or they're not clear what their consent language will be interpreted by their organization or their other institutions that they collaborate with. We try to help them understand, like, what we've learned in doing this for many other diseases and data sets. What we've been talking about is having a broader meeting with the communities that we've engaged with, just focusing on addressing some of these questions, because I can tell you, when we do this, one of the things that ends up happening is it's a bit of game of telephone. So you talk to the principal investigator, who then talks to his consortium members, then who talks to his data team, who talks to his, so you can go on and so on and so on. And so our hope is to try, we have been trying to meet with legal teams and other members of the each individual data sites to do this, but obviously it takes a lot of time, energy. What we've been beginning to think about is to really get together, to address this in a broader way, and I think talking to James at Montreal was really helpful for me, because obviously we only see what we see. I want to make sure in our calls that we really have this transparent interaction where we're trying to also create a platform that helps them, because we want to make sure that all those community members really are able to use things effectively. And I know that we have user experience things that are being discussed right now, so that researchers can help and understand and shape the platform. But I don't want to lose that side of that earlier and whatnot. So I think that's my last slide. I think we have some.
We have a few questions, so we can dive into those questions if you'd like, Colin.
I can address that question. Are there any rules about federally funded studies that their data must be shared? The answer is yes. Federal, both for NIH and FDA, there is a requirement in the agreement that data must be shared. In reality, we've seen challenges in that. Okay. And then I can talk to you, Kathy, more about that if you'd like, and more in detail. I heard last week that all ALS will be collecting on the platform that is different from the knowledge platform. If that's the case, we'll eventually. Yes, that is correct. What will happen is that all ALS will be put into a platform, and then it will be ultimately transferred into the synergy side of with Sage into this knowledge portal. Like I said, from an end user experience, you won't see anything. All these things will be connected. And that was sort of the goal. For data sharers like the Omics side that might have confidentiality concerns or whatnot, there are things that their consents that are prohibitive. We've been in discussions about indexing data so that at least there's some connectivity and acknowledgement of data over there. One of the reasons that would pose a problem across all of the data sets, I was trying to explain this to some of the researchers at the meeting, is that in many instances, when you're talking about things that go to regulatory discussions, like for example, if you wanted to do an endorsement for a biomarker, or we wanted to design a clinical trial simulation tool for patients that were in different stages of their disease, the FDA, in order to look at the algorithms and determine like whether or not that is fit for purpose, they have to see and receive the raw data. And so, federating all of this in all of those different warehouses wouldn't allow for that really, and it wouldn't be able to put it in the standard formats that are required for those reviews. So one of the things that's really a big barrier for that is that we really need to host this more centrally. Ideally in the community, we don't want to separate out like the good work that people are doing, but we want to find a compromise to figure out what we're, and hopefully add things that they might not have locally. So for example, if they don't have an analysis suite that, is usable within their own site, maybe that could be built into the platform. The users need to tell us that, right? So I think the idea is to try to, as I tell people, we're not going to be like cutting edge, like rocket knock down the wall science where you're cutting edge stuff. But if we can get to which is the A+, if we can get to a portal and things that are like a B range, B+ range, and give people an experience that's, hopefully somewhat better than they might have, that would be a great service to the community. And I talked to James. I mean, James is all in about sharing the ALS, and I think that that's part of the grantee, approval sign off was sharing. And we've talked about some early sharing of some of the data because we want to begin to look at the trajectory of some of the work that's being done and understand, like, okay, how long do we need to follow up? Are we seeing a lot of variability in the data, and we need to look at where that variability might be coming from? So, because one of the things that I'm getting off on a tangent, like one of the things that comes from a lot of different efforts and a lot of different methodologies is it becomes variability and noise. And what that means for like a sponsor or a researcher trying to design a study is that means more patients have to be enrolled, because that variability means statistically we have to create for that noise and we need to account for that. And so trying to create and unify and teach and learn from each other really can help us get to the point where, we're being most, I guess, efficient and judicious with, the community, because nobody wants to enroll huge studies. Nobody wants to have to wait longer than they have to. And so anything that we can do to prepare and to align and to collaborate to meet that, I think is really it should be a big priority to all of us.
And one last question, Colin, from Andrea. Does CPATH intend to collect only existing data from extant data sets, or to continue to collect from these data sets prospectively in a parallel fashion with all ALS?
Yes. The answer is yes. For ongoing natural history studies and things like that, we will be attempting to collect intermittently updates for the data. And why is that important? Why is that important, particularly as the field for ALS changes? I mean, I think the questions that we want to address may change. Like, give you an example, external controls. External controls, when tofersen was approved, the ability for SOD1 external controls kind of changed, right? Standard of care changed. So contemporary elements to data sets need to take that into account when you're trying to model that disease, or like for trial simulation tool, you might be looking at as a part of consideration of this statistical analysis for a biomarker. So it's going to be really important that we have, and we're discussing sort of the timelines for updates. And I love Terry because she thought of it way beforehand. Like, I'm talking to Terry from Answer. She's like, how often do you want to do updates? It's like, and that's going to be really, really important, because it's got to be contemporary. Typically, when you look at data from usefulness when it comes to regulatory considerations, one, standard of care change, and then there's usually a time window that's important to consider. And so that contemporaneous of the data is going to be really important for us to be sensitive to.
Great, thank you. So we have about 5 minutes left in our scheduled time today. I am glad to yield my time. If there are additional questions, you can add them to the chat. Otherwise, thank you everybody for joining us. We do this regularly every quarter. And so as we schedule those, we will notify you so you can register and participate. This is a chance to ask questions, but certainly in between these meetings, if things are on your mind, or you'd like clarity about some of the work that we're doing, feel free to reach out to me, and I will make sure that it gets routed to the right person, and then we get an answer to you. So thank you everybody, and appreciate you being here to join us today.
And thank you. And if there's anything in follow-up that you have questions, feel free to email Tom or I. I'm happy to connect as well. Hope everyone has a happy holiday.